From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, January 3rd. Happy New Year. Keith Wilson seemed to come out of nowhere. Until earlier last year, he was a trucking company president whose one previous attempt at elected office got paltry results. Then suddenly, he was a frontrunner in Portland's high-stakes mayoral race with an audacious pitch to solve the city's most difficult issue. Now, he's the mayor. Given that swift turn of events, you might be asking yourself, who is Keith Wilson? That's the question we're going to attempt to answer today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Dirk Vanderhart.
And I'm Portland politics reporter Alex Zielinski.
Alex, take us back to election night. Portland was trying ranked choice voting for the first time. There was all this uncertainty about when results would be available and maybe more importantly, when they would be actually definitive. I think we were fully prepared maybe to be left hanging when it came to who would be the city's next mayor. But then that just sort of didn't happen, right?
Yeah, we got a clear picture of who was in the lead right off the bat, which was a surprise. While we can't really use percentages of votes to talk about ranked choice results anymore, Wilson was holding a significant lead on election night over the top candidates. If you remember, there were nearly 20 people running for mayor in Portland, but everyone in the lead, aside from Wilson, they were all current council members. That's Renee Gonzalez, Mingus Mapps, and Carmen Rubio. Wilson rose to the top as kind of this anti-incumbent option for people seeking leadership beyond the status quo, and that seemed to work for him.
It felt like part of this victory, at least to me, was sheer energy. Like Wilson seemed like he was all over the place on the campaign trail making his pitch to Portlanders. But I'm guessing a lot of people, I mean, the reason we're doing this is we think maybe a lot of people
who is this guy?
Don't know a ton about him. Exactly.
Yeah.
You just did a big story about this. So start out with the broad strokes of his biography.
Sure, yeah. So Wilson grew up in the North Portland neighborhood of Portsmouth. He grew up in a low-income household, small house, one of 5 kids. His dad ran a pretty small trucking company. His mom was an Avon lady doing door-to-door sales. Wilson described himself as a happy-go-lucky kid. He played varsity basketball at Roosevelt High School. He went to undergrad at Oregon State University. He then did some post-college travel, worked in Europe and New York City for a bit, but returned to Portland to go to business school and to work for his dad's trucking company, which is called Titan Freight Systems. Wilson eventually took over that business and grew it into a multi-million-dollar company.
I mean, that's one of the ways he starts to come on the scene, right? The first time I came across Keith Wilson, he was pushing this bill to have the state phase out of petroleum diesel. You know, he is this trucking company owner not that long ago who was really zigging, I guess, when a lot of other folks in the trucking industry are zagging and making a name for himself that way.
Right, yeah. So in the 2010s, Wilson started really taking seriously the impact greenhouse gas emissions on his trucks had on the climate. It led him to switch Titan trucks to renewable diesel, like what you mentioned, which is this product made from animal fats and vegetable oil. It led to a 60% drop in his fleet's emissions in a year. He also made Titan the first trucking company in the state to use electric semi-trucks. It's worth noting that these are expensive changes, and he was still able to keep Titan in the green throughout. But, you know, what you mentioned, what I think is so interesting is that through this work, he turned into kind of the state cheerleader for renewable diesel. He started a PAC and lobbied the state legislature to phase out the sale of petroleum diesel statewide and make renewable diesel more accessible, something that you wrote about at the time. What I think is noteworthy about this is that it put him in direct opposition with his industry, or, at least the state's largest trucking lobby, who had real concerns about the supply and the cost of this relatively new fuel source. But Wilson really didn't budge. You know, he held the line on renewable diesel even when the bills he supported failed. And he kept paying dues to the trucking lobby. You know, it shows that he can disagree respectfully, I think.
I probably watched his sales pitch. I mean, he had this whole fleshed out presentation about renewable diesel. He was parading it before the legislature. Probably watched it 4 times. And he's very good at selling a message. I mean, like he was passionate about this issue, clearly really saw the benefits to it and cared about the climate and just had a cogent message, and clearly that has helped him in his current political circumstance. But, you know, he starts getting involved in politics at the state level in this fight for the environment. That's not the issue that got him interested in local politics, right?
Yeah. You know, it's a bit different. It was homelessness. Wilson said he first started thinking about this issue in the early 2000s when his older brother was experiencing homelessness on and off for a few years. His brother, his name is Carl, he also struggled with mental health issues and substance abuse, so a lot going on. And at the time, Keith and his parents were able to offer his brother a place to crash, but they were also kind of expected and tasked with navigating the complex local social safety net to try to help Carl for the long term, get him into permanent housing, which they were able to do. But, Wilson talks a lot about how fortunate his family was to have the resources and time to help Carl, and how he realizes not many do. And if you don't have that behind you, how are you expected to kind of get out of this system? I think seeing the flaws in it firsthand and seeing more and more people fall into homelessness in his hometown really impacted Wilson. His response to this was pretty on brand for him, a bit nerdy. He started researching how other cities across the country and world have successfully addressed homelessness, and felt like he had some ideas for Portland. So he brought them home and met with local elected officials to try to move the needle and get them on board. Here's how he described it to me.
So as I would learn things, I would talk to politicians here and say, hey, this city's doing a great job. And I would get the response, well, that's a smaller city than Portland. It won't work here. Mm-hmm. Or that's an East Coast city. That won't work here. And it seems like every time I talk to a politician, they didn't have time.
Yeah, and, for some reason, Wilson had the time, so he decided to run for city council in 2020 on a platform to address the city's homelessness crisis.
Well, one thing that comes across in your story is that he is almost an insatiable worker. It sounds like he maybe has some problems with boundaries, and
right.
So he it sounds like he found the time, made the time for that. But you mentioned he ran for city council. As I recall, that race was not a sparkling success that maybe Wilson envisioned at the time.
No, and to refresh folks' memory, this was a race for then Commissioner Chloe Udaley's seat. Wilson was running against Udaley, against former Mayor Sam Adams and current Commissioner Mingus Mapps, among others, and came in fourth in the primary, just 5% of the vote. As you know, Mapps won that race. It's funny thinking about that race in contrast with the mayor's race in November, where Mapps came in fourth to Wilson. Right. Maybe a sign of the shifting political winds. Anyway, Wilson lost his council race and he remained kind of a mystery to most Portlanders. I saw Chloe Udaley posted something on social media after this most recent election. Former commissioner who ran to try to keep her seat against Wilson. And she posted something saying, like, I'd completely forgotten that I ran against this guy who's now our mayor. He wasn't memorable at the time.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think that campaign, I guess, sort of seemed like it fell flat enough that a lot of people might be discouraged from running again, or else not saying, I'm going to run for a higher office than that, right? But Wilson, as we know, decided to come back and not just run for city council. He ran for mayor. He has an interesting story about how he made that decision.
Yeah, sure. And I think there are two stories here. One is more zoomed out. Wilson wanted to run for mayor for the same reason he ran for council, to address homelessness. He thought he had the solution, but he needed a nudge. And he said that came from his wife, Catherine Wilson. In December 2023, Catherine was going in for open heart surgery. On election night, Keith told this story about the moments before that operation.
But at 5 a.m. in the morning, while she's in the operating ready room and we're having our hellos and wondering what the other's thinking, and you're thinking hopeful, but in the same regard, you're so frightened. And the other person's frightened, but you don't want to show it. But she looks at me and she says, no matter what happens, you're going to run for mayor.
And Catherine told me that this was because she was so certain her husband was the right person for this moment in Portland, that he had put in so much work, maybe more work than necessary, researching homelessness, and was so tireless in his dedication that she would hate for him to give it up if something happened to her. It says a lot about her faith in him.
I feel like a lot has been talked about this year about this anti-incumbent mood that voters had nationally, locally. Mm-hmm. That seems to fit with Wilson's win. You mentioned he was up against 3 sitting city commissioners. Portlanders are not happy with their city, maybe happy to jettison those folks and try something new. But it also feels like Wilson was just making by far the most sort of brazen promise of any candidate. He's saying, I will solve unsheltered homelessness by 2026. How is he going to do this?
Yeah, well, first, let's define unsheltered homelessness, right? It's an umbrella term for anyone living outside of a building, like in a tent or a car. It's not the entire homeless population. A lot of people might be sleeping in shelters or crashing on a friend's couch, stuff like that. Anyway, Wilson's plan to get rid of unsheltered homelessness in Portland is to convert dozens of existing buildings into temporary nighttime shelters. That includes churches, community centers, other buildings that are unused at night. The idea is that these shelters will be the first entry point for people seeking help, where staff can connect them with services or housing or whatever. It's similar to the 24-hour shelters we already have in Portland, but cheaper.
This is, I mean, it's the kind of thing that might have made Portlanders say, no, we're not trying this again because, we are about to say goodbye to a mayor, Ted Wheeler, who came to office preaching essentially the exact same thing, preaching shelters as a means to help solve homelessness.
2 years, though. He said 2 years.
Okay, there we go. And here we are 8 years later, and we know how that turned out. Are voters here just buying the same false promise, sort of that cliche definition of insanity? Is something different? Like, what is this?
I mean, it's hard to say. I can kind of speculate on just like the fact that voters wanted something tangible. And like you said, no one else running for mayor really had a clear plan or a clear promise. When you ask Wilson, he says the difference is the level of research that he has put into this issue compared to Wheeler. Wheeler came in just, from the treasurer's office, state treasurer's office, and not having a ton of experience or background in homelessness and housing. Based on the observations Wilson has made in all these other cities that have decreased its homeless population, he really thinks that these nighttime shelters are particularly the missing piece that the city needs. And instead of, what Wheeler promised in 2017 was just we're going to build more shelters and move folks off the street. He has a very specific, like this type of shelter is the key. So
yeah,
who's to say?
I mean, Wheeler had experience administering government, right? As a Multnomah County chair, as a treasurer. But Wilson has sort of served and helped build shelters already as part of a nonprofit board and has worked in that space. So kind of an interesting contrast there. I mean, obviously, this was a popular sales pitch with Portlanders, given the results we saw. But as you and a lot of other people who have looked into this note, like, it is not popular with folks who are really on the front lines of homelessness in Portland. As he said, as Wilson said in that tape you played, he would ask people out and they say, no, this is East Coast. This is a small city. This can't work here. So help us understand the perspective. Are we doomed? Like, what do these people say about this idea?
Right. I mean, I'll start that, saying that even the critics really believe that Wilson's heart is in the right place and that his goal is a good one. But it's the details that start to get people close to this issue scratching their heads. So, in 2017 or so, local governments and the county and the city made a really intentional decision to shift all investments in nighttime shelters into shelters that operated 24/7. This nighttime shelters were more of a common piece of the puzzle. And Wilson will point to this moment as a massive catastrophe. He has this timeline or he had it on his campaign website saying, at this point, this is when the county and the city started going the wrong way. But there was a reason. People experiencing homelessness and shelter providers both said that overnight shelters weren't working, that, these are places where people have to line up every night to get in and leave early in the morning. It doesn't offer a lot of stability and security or privacy. It's usually a big open room with a bunch of cots or mats on the floor. A lot of people reported not feeling safe in these spaces. And at the same time, only being open at night made it hard for workers to be able to really connect with people, to that next step out of homelessness that Wilson has talked about. People were wanting to sleep, and a few service providers are answering their phones, at 2 a.m. to help connect the dots. So it felt like a better use of city funding to run shelters that are open 24/7, or people could store their stuff and not be rushed and be able to relax and unwind long enough to really feel ready to ask for help. And so that's kind of the crux of the criticism. I mean, there's some concerns around his funding estimates as well.
Yeah. $25 million to solve unsheltered homelessness.
Right, which is just a drop in the bucket. To be fair, overnight shelters are a lot more affordable to run than obviously running something 24/7. But knowing, which churches, which community shelter centers are going to be open to this is also a big question mark.
Yeah, the critique seems to be like, okay, you might get some people off the street for a night, but a lot of people are going to resist it. And those even that do access the shelters, as you said, are not maybe going to be accessing services as like they might with a different model. So let's try something that the advocacy community here thinks is a better fit. What does Wilson say to? I'm sure he's heard it a lot.
Yeah, he has big agree to disagree energy around this. He really thinks that the city and the county are throwing away money on these bigger shelter operations and that overnight shelters are an affordable way to get people moving off the street. He doesn't discount these critiques, but it seems like he's not going to let any dissenters stand in the way between him and his plan.
Where does the city's sweep policy fit into this, right? Because there has been this sense that if there's not shelter space to move people into, we shouldn't be sweeping. Is that part of Wilson's calculus here, that he wants to be able to more easily move encampments, and by having enough shelter space, that will be easier?
He hasn't explicitly said that, But I think it's a piece of it. Portland has this kind of anti-camping policy now, which relies on there being enough shelter beds open so a police officer can say, or an outreach worker, whatever, can say, hey, you can't sleep here, but there's a shelter down the road that's open that you can go to. And right now in Portland, we don't have the capacity to meet that. And so that policy is not really being enforced at all. And Wilson has talked about, this having enough shelter beds available will make it easier to end unsheltered homelessness, which is a way of saying to remove the sight of people camping on the streets. And at the same time, he's very strongly, against criminalizing homelessness.
Right.
And so he's kind of proposed an idea of maybe like a 3 or 5 strikes you're out kind of plan for folks sleeping outside if they refuse shelter a number of times. If there's shelter available, that maybe they'll get written up then, but kind of remains to be seen what that will look like in practice.
Yeah, he's taking definitely a softer stance than other city leaders. We had a story last week about how cities across the state want lawmakers to give them more leash, essentially, to crack down on camp. And Wilson has said he doesn't support that. So he is taking a different tack, certainly, than some other folks. You noted this in your story, Alex. Running a city is very, very different than running a trucking company. There is a lot Wilson won't be able to control as he's looking to roll out this very sort of definitive agenda. What are his chances? I mean, how's he looking at it? What do you see coming down the pike?
Yeah, I mean, the private sector is a different beast than the public sector. Under Portland's newly overhauled form of government, too, Wilson doesn't get to propose legislation on city council. He holds a more administrative role. He's mostly responsible for enforcing laws that have been passed by city council. But, he told me that he doesn't think it precludes him from getting this shelter plan off the ground. That's because Portland already has this anti-camping law that I mentioned, and he thinks that increasing shelter supply could be considered part of the plan to enforce that law, which would be his purview as mayor. And so he still sees his ability to kind of unilaterally move this proposal forward, not being slowed down by city council or by the bureaucracy that is city government. At the same time, it's going to be probably a bad look for him just to steamroll his plan through without the buy-in of the new council.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've also heard him say, look, I've sat down with all of our council members-elect. I've given them a sense of my plan, and he, at least I feel like he's suggested many of them, if not all, are sort of on board.
Right.
I mean, what is your sense of how this incoming crop of new council members might handle it? There's obviously a lot of divergent sort of political positions on the council.
Yeah, from what I've heard, they're all somewhat on board. I think it's too soon for a lot of them to immediately be going to bat against their new mayor. I think the tricky thing is that he hasn't rolled out specific details, at least not publicly, on how this will all work, like which churches and other places are going to be used, how are they going to be staffed, what options are available for folks, all of that. What I've heard is from incoming council members is cautious optimism about his general goal to end unsheltered homelessness. I don't think anyone disagrees with that idea. But I do think it's a relationship that this idea has with the anti-camping penalties, where I think he might get pushback. If it looks like these shelters are just being set up to give the city a green light to crack down on homeless encampments, that'll be a problem with some of the more kind of left-leaning councilors. There are people who ran specifically on an anti-camping ban platform, anti-camping ban. At the same time, some councilors may want him to go the other direction and crack down harder. Portlanders elected a pretty politically diverse council, like you mentioned, and it has a few more law and order types on it as well. What I've heard from people who know Wilson well is that he's open-minded. I think he will change course if he hears a convincing argument otherwise.
Right.
I do think there's wiggle room if councilors aren't thrilled right off the bat.
And full disclosure, we are recording this not long, actually, before all the city council and Wilson are sworn into their new positions, certainly before they actually take office. So we don't know how this is going to shake out yet, but it's certainly something that we are going to be watching play out. I'm sure you and I are going to be talking lots about this in the future. Alex, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
This episode of OPB Politics Now was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Stephen Cray. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. In the meantime, check out all of OPB's political coverage at opb.org. And one more thing, we're trying something different this year. We obviously spend this podcast asking and answering big questions about politics across Oregon and Southwest Washington. Now we want to know what questions you have. Send your questions about politics in Oregon and Southwest Washington, big or small, to OPB Politics Now at opb.org. We will do our best to answer. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.